Happy Friday and welcome to another edition of the Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com and FL1 Radio. Election day is behind us and we have so much to unpack, discuss, and figure out here. With me is Ted Baker, host of Finger Lakes Morning News. He is back on the program. You hear him daily on a collection of local radio stations, including WGVA and WAUB, part of the Finger Lakes Radio Group. Ted, thanks for coming back.
Always a pleasure.
I bet you, along with all the rest of us, are breathing a sigh of relief now that election season is over. It's done. Goodbye.
I guess, although somebody made the point that Wednesday began the 2020 presidential campaign. So
Let's start there then. Have we reached a point where that really is exactly where we are now? Like we're already 2020, forget 2019, because there are a bunch of local elections that are going to take place in 2019. Are we jumping that far ahead already?
Not quite, but we're close. I mean, it's almost always campaign time. I mean, that's you ask a member of Congress what's their job one the first day they go back to office, and it's start raising money for the next cycle. I mean, that's what it takes to get elected.
So let's unpack a little bit on the surface. We have a lot of reader questions that we're going to get to this hour. Voter turnout. Do you think it met the expectation or the hype that we seem to be getting in the weeks and really months, weeks, and days leading up to Election Day?
Well, in one sense, I guess it did, but in the other, I haven't seen all the turnout figures, but I think it was Monroe County was 59% or something, and that's great, relatively speaking, but it's a little bit sad, on the other hand, to think that with all of the issues and all the things there are to decide, that 41% didn't even think it was necessary to show up, and that's 41% of registered voters. That's not counting the people that don't even register.
Right. What does it even take? And that's something that I think about all the time is like, what does it take? And I think of young people. I think of my friends. I think of the people who, pretty much I go to the least politically engaged people I know, and I think to myself, what would it take to get them willing to vote? A lot of them, it didn't happen in 2016 when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were on the ballot, and when things seemed about as politically divisive next to this most recent election cycle. It didn't happen then. It didn't happen this time. What's the secret formula, or is there even one?
Well, I think often it's a few years and home ownership and taxes and kids in school. I think that's when people start to become a little more engaged. The first time you get a tax bill and you say, oh, okay, it matters who I vote for in terms of what my tax bill is going to be, or who are the members on my school board. So I think a lot of times that's what it is. If you're young and single and renting an apartment, you maybe don't think of those issues so much because it really doesn't affect you that much who's in office.
And I think that's an interesting point because, we talk about getting people involved, but there is an element, I think, of when you don't even have these very basic needs being met or getting met, how can you expect those folks to get involved? So the people who are, living in one community, so for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and then moving somewhere else because that's where work takes them.
Right.
If you don't plant roots, and fewer people seem to be planting roots now, how can you ever expect them to really get engaged like that?
I'm not really sure. If you don't care, maybe it's better off that you don't vote.
It's interesting you say that because I did see a couple different exchanges over the last, say, like week and a half leading up to Election Day where some people were actually saying, I'm not going to tell every Tom, Dick, and Harry to go out and vote. I'm going to tell informed voters to go out and vote. I'm not going to encourage people who aren't educated on the subject matter, on the candidates, casting ballots. How much does that actually stymie the kind of, it's almost, I kind of liken it to people who just vote one party straight across the ballot and don't give any thought or process to where the individuals stand on the various issues inside the various races. Is that almost the same thing in your mind?
I think so. I think part of it is there's such a media overload now. We have this medium that we're on. We have talk radio 24/7. Yep. We have 24-hour cable channels that have to have content. And so I think there's a certain amount of people just checking out. I mean, by the time you've seen that same negative ad for the 100th time, I think some people just say, you know what, I don't care who wins, just let it be Wednesday.
Did you catch any of the ones that we had heard a bunch of complaints from people saying that they were actually seeing the same ad twice during the same TV commercial segment?
Yeah,
Did you happen to catch any of those?
Yeah, we run into the same thing on occasion in radio. You've only got so many breaks in an hour, and if somebody wants 5 commercials in an hour and you got 4 breaks, we're not going to turn down their money. We'll take the money. So you give as much separation as you can. But yeah, I mean that's and almost all the time you get back-to-back opposing ads. You get your Tom Reed ad, and then the very next one's your Tracy Matrano ad.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, let's talk about radio a little bit, because that is still, I think, for the people who consider themselves the most connected to politics, that seems to be where the most in-depth conversations and things like that are actually happening, is on AM radio. What is your take after going through this most recent cycle, where it seemed we were hearing a bit more from the different talking heads and political pundits on radio as opposed to in other cycles?
In terms of
just how much of an impact they seem to be having, despite the idea that, you know, some folks believe radio, along with, you know, some of the other traditional formats, aren't as powerful or even working as well as they did in the past.
Well, I think the figure is still something north of 90% of people listen to radio at some point during the week. It's also, with all the emphasis on not using handheld devices in the car, it's one of the things that we run on our station is something to the effect of, you know, we're the original information app, so you can always turn us on and listen. So I think talk radio has a big impact, and there's a lot of time, hopefully, to get into things more in depth. I had a number of the local candidates on. My record's unblemished, by the way. I had 2 of the 3 candidates for Seneca County Sheriff on, and the one that I didn't have on got the most votes.
And that race in particular, I think.
Seneca County Judge.
Yeah. Our viewers and listeners definitely knew what you were getting at. Let's talk about that race a little bit. Were you surprised at all by the outcome? Obviously, not totally decided yet. Barry Porsche and David Ettman are separated by roughly 100 votes. I think around 750 or 800 absentees left to go. What is your read on that sitting right now and how it might play out?
Well, I'm not a Seneca County resident, and there's no polling or anything. Just I work with Greg Cotterill, who's from Seneca County, and he seemed to think that Barry Porsche would come out on top. So I'm not too surprised. If you'd asked me to predict ahead of time, I really wouldn't have had very much to go on.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my question about those types of races, so the judge races, judgeship is not something that in theory should be political in any way, shape, or form. But they always seem to get political. All these races, whether it's, town justice or town clerk or whatever the case may be, shouldn't be politicized, but ends up being politicized anyway through the ads and the mailers, and even sometimes what the candidates will say themselves during the process. Is there something broken about the system that creates that situation, or is that just naturally what is going to happen when you have a race happening?
I think it's what's going to happen. I think, to use a sports analogy, the strategies and tactics you see at the NFL work their way down to college football, then they work their way down to high school football, and now I do public address for youth football, and I see the little flag kids that are 6 years old trying to throw passes all the time. So, I think it's kind of trickle down. They see these tactics employed at the higher levels and effectively by some candidates. So I think it's a case of what will win for me, and if being more political or going negative at lower level races is going to win, that's what I'm going to do to win.
So first reader question of the hour. Mike from Geneva wants to know, was it actually a blue wave? And he has a second part to that question. Do you think Congress will work with President Trump?
Well, I think it was a blue wave. However, it was countered by a pretty equivalent red wave. Turnout was up all the way around. Typically, in midterm elections, there's a change against the party in power. I think the Republicans did a very good job of motivating their voters to come out by making it, ironically, the Democrats originally wanted to make it a referendum about Donald Trump, And the Republicans said, okay, yeah, let's make it a referendum about Donald Trump because we think he did a great job. So I think there were waves on both sides. I think that's why the gain wasn't as big for the Democrats as you might normally see in a midterm, because I think both sides did a very good job of getting people out.
Was it do you think it was the Donald Trump base that was mobilized and that got out, or was it more of the middle of the road Republican voters?
I think on the right, on the Republican side, I think it was the base. Mm-hmm. On the Democratic side, I think it was more new voters, some of those young voters, and people becoming issue aware for the first time. But yeah, I think that's what there was a wave, but there was a balancing wave that countered it. Had the Republicans not motivated their voters, there would have probably been a bigger gain of seats in the House, and maybe a couple of those close Senate races might have gone the other way.
So obviously another one of the items, the other half of that question is, do you think Congress will be able to work with Donald Trump? I've thought about this, and the big press conference that got a whole lot of attention on Wednesday. I think he could. I think there's common ground, especially around infrastructure. There seems to have been since he took office, or at least going by what he has said. But I almost wonder if we're at a point where everything is so divided right now that he just can't. Because if he does, he'll be making a concession that his base just won't accept. And now he is in full-blown re-election mode, campaign mode. So you've got to assume that over the next 2 years, he's not going to be that motivated to work with Congress, right?
Well, I have a shorter answer to your question, and that is no.
Just outright no.
No. That train left the station a long time ago. I think the days of the two sides working together are over. I think it's going to be now which side can win and have the most control. So you'll have a Democratic House, which will make it harder for the Republicans to get bills passed. So I think the ground will shift now to executive orders.
So to that end, how damaging is it to our political process and our government that we kind of break ourselves into, or box ourselves into these little 2-year spans where one party might have control of all three chambers, and that's really the only time that anything of substance or of size gets done or gets passed, and then the rest of the time it's just defense. So like that 2008 to 2010 window, and now you have the 2016 to 2018 window. Outside of that, it just seems like a lot of gridlock and back and forth and not a lot of process. Does that just crush our system?
Well, I think partly that's how our system was built. I mean, the checks and balances. People complained about the Electoral College that cost Hillary Clinton the presidency, but the reason for having the Senate with equal representation by states, the House with representation by population, I think the founders kind of wanted it so neither side could really run with the ball too much at any given time. So, but in the larger sense, yeah, I think at some point the two sides are going to have to come together and say, okay, there's got to be something we agree on that we can work on together. We know some of the problems we face as a nation. We know that Democrats and Republicans have different ideas as to the best way to solve those problems, but where can we find some kind of common ground? I think at some point there's got to be a movement in that direction. If you were just going to sort of cherry pick, what are a couple of those items that you think right now they could manage to get on the same page and come up with something? Well, I think one of the biggest things is still its economic issues. Unemployment's low, but a lot of these jobs that people have are 30 hours a week, no benefits, trying to scrape by. All across rural America, the old manufacturing jobs have gone away. I think one of the biggest reasons, and I think Democrats still have not fully understood a lot of what got Donald Trump elected, which was a lot of disaffection across the rural part of America about just changes in the fundamental way of life. And a lot of it comes down to these economic issues. I mean, where are we going to find jobs to replace all these good factory jobs that people used to be able to get? I mean, I live in Rushville, used to have the food canning factory there. somebody could come out of high school without a great deal of training or post-high school education, go get a good job and raise a family. And in rural parts of America, including upstate New York, they're finding that hard to do. And I think that was a big reason that Donald Trump got elected.
So, and I'm glad you brought that up, the whole kitchen table economics. We heard a lot of Republicans running on that, and even a couple of Democrats who are more leaning towards the center. If that's the make or break, and Democrats haven't figured it out yet, and some of the Democratic candidates were pretty close or kind of close to winning races if they didn't win and take a seat away from Republicans. Do they get the message to keep going a little further that way and come up with that, or does the more progressive side of the party ultimately win out over the next 2 years and take them the opposite way?
I think we're seeing a move in that direction. I mean, for example, Tracy Matrano, I think, was not originally supported by the party. The Democratic Party tends to prefer a little more centrist, a little more corporate-friendly candidates, while the voting base says, let's be full-blown Democrats. Let's be Elizabeth Warren-type Democrats, or Kirsten Gillibrand, who's already being bandied about as a potential presidential nominee for the Democrats in 2020. So there's that battle going on, and I think that's one of the things that's benefited the Republicans. I think they're better overall at party discipline. They, and again, you look at Donald Trump. Early in 2016, nobody on the Republican side wanted Donald Trump as president. But when it became clear that he was going to take the nomination, even Ted Cruz, who he referred to as Lion Ted Cruz, lines up behind Trump. Trump comes out and campaigns for him, and he wins his reelection. So I think Republicans have done a better job of sort of herding all those cats into one direction than the Democrats have. I think they're still kind of battling it out between the corporate centrist wing of the party and the actual voters who are a little bit further out to the left.
How is it that the average voting population's memory is so short that they forget about that dynamic? Especially you named the Cruz-Trump dynamic. How is that not? So you have Trump going out and stumping for Cruz for his reelection campaign, and it was a bloodbath between the two of them 2.5 years ago. Is that just where we are, where people don't really think about things beyond a couple months maybe, or a couple news cycles ago?
Well, I think number one, guys like you and me that do this for a living think about it a lot more than the average voter. And then I think secondly, there's a feeling that what you say during campaigns really doesn't matter once the campaign is over. I think there's that feeling it's just politics. So yes, I called my opponent a name. Bernie Sanders calls Hillary Clinton every name in the book, but then when she gets the nomination, okay, all my supporters line up behind her. I think there's just that feeling that campaigns are all just kind of a big theater, and that once they're done, everything we said doesn't count anymore.
And doesn't that feed right into the whole grudge that people have with politics in general?
Yeah.
Is that, these candidates run on a platform and then they're doubling back, or they're not following through on certain things because of one interest or another. It's all feeding to the same system, right?
I think it does, yeah. I think we have a fundamental problem that I don't know if we're going to be able to solve anytime real soon.
So you mentioned the Reed-Matrano race. I think that for me was probably one of the two most surprising races in the area. The Cadco-Balter race was a little bit more of a surprise. Reed held on, though. He gets another term. Does this feel like the last one for him? Because it seems like his stronghold in the 23rd is subsiding a little bit. It's like Democrats are chipping away a little more each cycle at what he has established.
Well, I think part of it goes back to what you were saying earlier in the whole economic thing. There's been an outflow of people from upstate New York. I think most of those people are from the rural areas, and most of those people are Republican voters. So I think a lot of the people leaving the state are Republican voters. A lot of the ones staying are Democratic voters in the cities where the economy's better. I thought, Tom Reed is by most accounts a pretty centrist, as is Katko for that matter, a pretty centrist Republican, not a fire-breathing Tea Partier. So between having the advantage of incumbency and I thought the whole, I love those signs, Tom for Congress. When you talk to him, he's a very unassuming guy, regular kind of guy, and he's the kind of guy that everybody knows I tend to lean to the left. He's a Republican that I can support because you go, okay, this is a decent guy, means well, wants to do the best for the district.
And it's funny because there are, Jackie Augustine is a great example. We were talking on election night about it, and she is very unhappy with his performance in the district over his 2 terms prior. And it's interesting because I think you have to be pretty well informed and connected politically to know that he has, if you believe that he's dropped the ball at all, I think you have to be pretty well informed to be able to identify that. And the vast majority of voters just don't see it.
Well, that's true. And I'm a believer. I don't think that politicians have as much impact as they want us to think. It's the whole thing, again, with the elimination of manufacturing jobs. Is that any party's fault or any politician's fault? I don't think it is. I think it's, more automation. You used to have the guy who put the windshield on in the car factory. Now it's a robot arm that comes over and does that. That's not the fault of any political party. So I don't know that those people have as much impact on our lives as maybe they would like us to think that they do.
So then the Katko-Balter race, obviously a different district, a little further east, a little more urban, I guess you'd say, too, at the same time. Interesting because it seemed to have 2 of the most central candidates that you could possibly have. And for a district that actually serves part of Onondaga County, seems surprising, right?
Well, I thought Dana Balter ran a strong campaign. I don't know what the final percentage was, 55, 45 or something in that neighborhood. Yep. And I thought, frankly, and I've said this on the air on the radio, I thought Congressman Katko ran an extremely dishonest campaign. His central premise was that his opponent was a carpetbagger, using the term visiting professor from Connecticut, when in fact she's lived in upstate New York for something like 15 years. There was the whole issue about you'll have an increase in taxes, which was a soundbite taken from an answer to a specific question, not a general belief in philosophy. I thought that was deceptive. And then there was the whole thing about the taxes in Florida, which it turns out the reason she didn't pay her taxes in Florida is because she disputed them, and the state agreed and reduced the bill down to something like $47, which she then paid with penalty. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, let's be 100% fair. She also went negative in some of her advertising.
Yeah.
But so it's, I think those races turned out about as I expected they would. I figured both Democrats would probably make a strong showing. I just think the numbers are a little bit against them. Like you said, that 24th is a little more urban. It includes Syracuse.
Yeah.
The registration numbers might be a little more closer there. But I thought those went probably about as I expected, that those 2 would be reelected.
So I think the race in New York, the congressional race in New York that people seem to be watching most closely was obviously Congressman Chris Collins' race with Nate McMurray, a Democrat that if you ever wanted to see somebody running a central campaign, that man was running a central campaign. He was appealing directly to Republicans, but he somehow still managed to hang on and win, or at least it seems like it. He called for a recount. He can't call for a recount. He wants every ballot counted. They're in this limbo right now. There are absentee ballots to count. He's only down like 3,000 votes. So I guess the question is, what the hell does that say about the state of affairs where someone who is facing serious charges and allegations could be reelected? It seems like by a miracle.
Well, let me see if I can do this without my partisan hat on. But first, we're seeing this with Donald Trump supporters. I think there's a growing tendency on the right to simply disregard information that doesn't match your preconceived notions. So I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of people who think that the congressman did nothing wrong. He hasn't been convicted of anything. if there were ever an open shut case, this would seem to be it. He gets word that this clinical trial and this drug has failed, and the stock that he and a lot of his friends hold or held, I don't think he had any at that point, but people close to him did. He contacted them immediately and said, dump this stock, it's going to go down, and they all dumped the stock. I mean, it's a pretty open shut case. So I think I'd be willing to believe that a lot of people who voted for him don't believe the charges at all and think they're made up. And the second factor is it's that Republican Party unity. Republicans are going to vote for Republicans. It doesn't matter if Gandhi had been running, they're going to vote for the Republican.
And it's interesting too because he made his TV rounds yesterday, and is saying, I'm going to serve the district. We're going to get through this. He's going to spend the next 2 years realistically fighting this legal case, and on top of that, he's been stripped of all of his committee assignments in Congress.
Right.
What the hell is he going to do?
Not much.
And it goes back to this point of, like you're saying, this really entrenched party politics. At what point does it just reach a point of, it's almost laughable? Like the system it's not working so well. It's working so poorly.
Well, at the risk of sounding glib, if the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States didn't get us to that point, I'm not sure anything ever can.
But the thing is here is I can completely, and I'll jump on the defending Donald Trump wagon for a moment. Not something I do very often publicly, but there are things, and I think some of the things that Donald Trump or President Trump has done successfully thus far in his term, or that he's been able to take credit for thus far in his term, were largely pushed to the back of the stove in the weeks and months leading up, meaning the economy. The economy was the thing that everyone was thinking that he would be focusing on. He didn't go there, and it just seems like, there are good things happening if you're a Republican and you believe that Donald Trump is the best thing for the party and for the United States, but this is not that. This is not that at all. Like this, Chris Collins is somebody who is the epitome of the swamp. So if draining the swamp were the goal, it doesn't align. It doesn't mesh to me. Like I don't even see a Donald Trump voter in the same category as a Chris Collins voter.
Well, I think that part of it is that good news doesn't motivate people. Fear is a wonderful motivator. So instead of talking about unemployment is low, because, if unemployment's low, I've got a job. I had a job last year. I had a job 10 years ago. So do I care about unemployment? All I care about is mine. As long as my unemployment is at 0%, I'm happy. So, but fear is a great motivator. So we get the migrant caravan. Oh my God, here come the scary people to invade the borders. And if you elect Democrats, all these bad things will happen. Again, and I say this with all admiration, one of the things that the Republicans have done that's been very effective is they have turned the word liberal into an insult and an epithet. Have you ever seen a liberal candidate run an ad saying, my opponent is a conservative? Mm-hmm. They don't. But we have Tracy Matrano, extreme ethical liberal. She's going to tax you. It's been very effective. They've got a lot of people believing that liberal is a bad thing rather than just the opposite side of the two-party system.
So, assuming that everything continues on course with the Collins-McMurray race and that plays out as expected and Collins retains, it sets up for a special election possibility. And I guess I had heard a couple different times on talk radio, Lonsbury's program, the theory was thrown out there that Republicans should have to own it. They should have to own the Collins mess, so that was why some of the Republican voters turned out and actually voted for him. Make them own everything about that situation. I just think that when you have a viable candidate on the ballot, it seems incredibly counterintuitive to try and stick it to the party when you could just elect somebody more fit to serve, right?
Yeah, you would think so, but I think that in one respect, I think our politics are sort of outstripping our ability to measure them. I mean, we saw that in 2016. All the experts, Nate Silver, 538, which I realize nobody but political junkies know what that is. He had Hillary winning. There was no way Trump was going to win. Well, he didn't anticipate that some people that normally vote Democratic would stay home in 2 or 3 states, and some normal, people that vote Republican would turn out, and that, Wisconsin and Michigan and states like that would make the difference. And I think, and that's what a lot of the Republicans were saying, right up until Election Day, there'll be no gain of seats in the House. So I think that our ability to gauge some of these things and measure and figure out what voters want are not keeping up. And the other thing, someone asked me this question the other day, which is a very good question. Who's taking these polls? When my phone rings, if it doesn't have a name and my contacts on it, I don't answer it. I think most people are that way. So who are these people that are telling us who's going to win? They're people who are too dumb to not answer a robocall, I guess. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's a lot of this stuff's done by phone. I don't know about you, but when my phone rings, if it has a number, I ignore it. If it has a name in my contacts, I answer it.
Yeah, and I think that is a pretty good question, because I don't know what the answer to that one is, and I don't think even if I knew that some sort of polling entity were calling me, I don't think I would answer. I think that would actually encourage me not to answer, frankly.
And how many people answer dishonestly just for fun?
Right, that's a very good point. You do also see some of the, and I was catching it on Google a lot, probably because of what my search history was and how news skewed it is. I was seeing a lot of polls online, and I know some of those were getting sort of fed back into like CNN and some of the other national outlets. It's interesting. Like I'm not really sure. And what would be the best modern way to poll or gauge the electorate now, given what we know about turnout, given what we know about who's engaged, who's not engaged, how fickle that whole balance can be? What is the modern way, since people don't answer their home phones? I would imagine that the traditional polling system is probably pretty aligned with the tendencies of somebody from maybe the 70s or 80s.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
like when
I would expect
and
it skews toward older voters, people with landline phones. I guess social media. I guess a Facebook poll group or something, or poll by Twitter would be the way to.
And with the bots and the fake accounts and everything else that you see on social media, that's it.
Although having said that, it sounds like most of the polling this time around was fairly accurate. I can't think of a race really off the top of my head that was shockingly different than what the experts said.
So to that end, does that attribute more to, because earlier when I asked about the blue wave, I didn't really think of this as much of a blue wave as it was just sort of the natural ebb and flow of, the way things swing every 6 or so years. Could you gauge most of these numbers in any given race or any given district by just sort of evaluating how many voters there are, how many usually turn out in any given cycle, and where the candidates stand in relation to past candidates?
Oh, I think that's almost exactly it. I think in midterm elections, it's all turnout. And that's why I said very early on that I thought there was a blue wave, but I thought it was countered by an equivalent red wave. I mean, I think I saw the statistic, I believe I have this correct, that Beto O'Rourke in Texas got more votes than Hillary Clinton did in the presidential race in 2016, but yet it wasn't enough because Republicans ramped up their turnout as well for Ted Cruz.
So let's talk about, this was one we touched on a little bit this morning on your show, Finger Lakes Morning News. Governor Cuomo gets another term. Some people scratching their heads, some people saying yes, other people just kind of like whatever, status quo for New York. Where do you come down on it, and then were you surprised at all by the numbers and also by the polls, which seem to be off pretty badly in this one?
I wasn't real surprised. The biggest issue for the Republicans was corruption, and I had Brian Kolb on again this morning, and I've talked to him a lot of times. I don't think that ever resonated with very many people. I think corruption is what we've come to expect out of our politicians. It's a feature, not a bug. And on the other hand, if you're Andrew Cuomo and the Democrats, as long as the downstate economy is strong, you're going to get reelected. It's just, I was talking to you about that map. It's so stark when you see the map showing these little blue dots where all the cities are and the big red rest of New York State. So we have a state where the vast majority of people live in about 9 counties out of the 60-something. So from strictly a political standpoint, if I'm Andrew Cuomo, why do I give a damn about upstate? As long as the downstate economy's fine. Again, if I've got a job in Rockland County or whatever, and I'm making $100,000 a year, and I got a nice house, what do I care if somebody's dipping into the public trough a little bit? I don't think those issues resonate.
It's interesting because it did seem like, and maybe this was just for the more connected voters and the people who are more engaged in it. It seemed like there was an effort out of Molinaro's camp to focus, or at least him personally, focus on the sort of the management side of New York, which I thought was interesting because for those of us who are connected to the news cycle in New York State, you see pretty quickly how mismanaged the state is in terms of how programs are administered, how they're set up, who's benefiting from them. And yet that didn't really seem to hit either. And that kind of amazes me because it seems like every day we hear people complain about how much of a gap there is between upstate and downstate and the southern tier. And it's like, where were you?
Well, see, I think the reason we hear that every day is because we're up here. I think if we, if we were based in Queens, I don't think we'd be hearing any complaints. I think it goes back to, I think you called it the kitchen table issues earlier. If I've got a good job and my life is good and my family's good, then what do I care that the Thruway Authority is mismanaged or it costs too much money to build the new Tappan Zee Bridge? I mean, I don't think that Republicans, number one, the numbers are against them. If every single Republican in the state of New York turned out to vote, that's still not enough to win if the Democrats have any kind of turnout at all. But I don't think they've found an issue yet that will resonate with those downstate voters. I mean, that's, okay, you've convinced everybody in upstate New York that Cuomo's a crook. Great, that gets you 10% of what the votes you need.
It's interesting because you do, and now we step forward, and the focus is going to be on 2020, and Andrew Cuomo's desire possibly to run for president. You mentioned Kirsten Gillibrand earlier, a little bit of a New York showdown maybe coming up. What would that look like, and how much of a tailspin could that possibly put New York State in politically, given that you're talking about two of the, as far as vote getters are considered, they're the tops of that list?
It'll be pretty interesting. I don't know. I know that Senator Schumer is one of the big power brokers in the Democratic Party. My understanding is he's not terribly fond of Kirsten Gillibrand, so I don't know if he would come down on Cuomo's side. It's as I look at the 2020 race, here we are doing it, I don't see anybody on the Democratic side who strikes me as really electable. I mean, Cuomo, Gillibrand, Elizabeth Warren, I mean, any of those would, again, be easily paintable as a liberal who's going to tax you to death, open up the borders. I mean, the campaign ads write themselves. Mm-hmm. I almost get a feeling that the nominee isn't going to be one of those people that we expect. It may be another Barack Obama type phenomenon where somebody that's not even on the radar right now is the nominee in 2020.
What about the prospect of it being just essentially, I hate to use this term, but like a sacrificial lamb, where there isn't any real optimism about electing anyone, so they just throw someone up there who, fills that gap until they run in 2024 when there might be more realistic.
I don't think Democrats are going to give up on 2020. I think they see Donald Trump as something waiting to happen. All depends on the Mueller investigation. We've had the Attorney General step down, talk, will Mueller be fired? What's going to happen there? If a report ever does come out, how many people will it convince? But I think I don't think it'll be a sacrificial lamb candidacy, because I think that Democrats see Donald Trump as very beatable in 2020. But it's kind of interesting. It's the same thing, sort of the corruption angle, trying to make it stick. Here's a guy that doesn't like the press and, calls people out by name. We don't have to go on with the litany of complaints against Donald Trump. So I don't think it's a sacrificial lamb. I just think that the candidates that I see being named right now as front runners seem to me like the kind that can be painted as the same old brand of Democrat. Cory Booker? Will it be somebody like Cory Booker? Somebody said Beto O'Rourke. He had a great run for Senate. He's got some national name recognition. So I have the feeling, I would say right now, Warren, Gillibrand, Cuomo, between those three, the chance that one of those three will be the nominee, I would say 10% or less.
Interesting. So let's talk about some of the third-party candidates that were involved in the race for governor. It seemed to be there was a lot of a lot of support for guys like Larry Sharpe, Stephanie Miner, if you paid attention to social media. But like always, that fizzled. There's no real chance of a third-party candidate winning, especially with how engaged the other two parties are right now. Is it a wasted vote voting for a third-party candidate? That seemed to be the question that everybody kept coming back to when Election Day came and now went.
I say no, because if you honestly don't agree with the other two parties, then I don't think you should just line up with the parties. I'm registered as an independent. I tend to lean leftward, but not on everything. But the idea, I don't like the idea of, okay, I'm a Republican, I believe this on this list of issues. I'm Democrat, I believe this. I believe some of over here and some of over here. So, and also, if you're going to make progress, it has to come slowly. So if I'm a third party that wants to be viable, I'm not going to get 40% of the vote in the next election. Maybe I get 8% this time, and 12% the time after that, and 20% the time after that. I think it's a process that you have to go through. So, I think people should vote their beliefs. I understand that when you vote, because most of these third parties tend to be left-leaning, and they tend to peel votes away. Look at 2016. Again, part of the reason Donald Trump got elected is because some Bernie Sanders supporters couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton, so they stayed home or they voted for a third party, a Jill Stein or somebody. I understand that in the short run you may cause somebody who you really disagree with to be elected, but I think over the long run, if you want to build any kind of third party, you have to do it one step at a time.
It's interesting, and it does, because there did seem to be a lot of discussion about, well, you need to get the threshold so that you can stay on the ballot, so you can keep building. But it just seems so futile to sort of go through this effort when they aren't, these people just aren't contending. And a lot of people thought that Stephanie Miner was somebody who could have easily been on one of the main tickets without any hesitation, but even she couldn't crack that a real meaningful threshold. And it makes me wonder. It's like, the parties are so powerful. What is even the point of getting in line with it? And I completely agree with not just jumping in line with the party for the sake of it, but it sort of goes back to the educated voter part of it, where it's like, if you're not going to think about the what could possibly create change, real change, if you're unhappy with the status quo, you have to at some point concede parts to get to a result you want, right?
Well, I think part of it too, when you look at New York, we have all these third and fourth and fifth and sixth parties that really exist for no other reason than to allow someone to claim a ballot line. So, like I say, we go through these primaries, and so you lose the Republican primary, so you grab the Conservative Party line. You lose the Democratic Party, so now I'm on the Working Party line. I think it's a little different dynamic in New York versus nationally. I think it's silly that we go through these primaries so often in New York to eliminate no one, because whoever loses just grabs the endorsement of some other minor party line, and they're still on the general ballot.
Mm-hmm. So our last question is actually from a reader. L asked, in Lansing, given the policy and the progress of this particular cycle, so the things that were talked about, the turnout, the results, what is the likelihood that it engages more people next year when more local elections are playing out?
Well, it's always hard to predict because we sit here and talk about politics, and something could happen 2 weeks from now that we're not even thinking about now that changes the dynamic of everything. But I think in general I see, especially again among the younger people, a higher level of engagement. I mean, we had, in Florida there was a huge uptick in young people registration based on the Parkland shooting. Those Parkland students suddenly found themselves thrust into the spotlight, and to their credit, I thought, acquitted themselves well and made themselves spokespersons for some of these causes. So I guess I'm hopeful as much as anything, because the real answer to all these problems that we've talked about is more engaged people and more voting. I think my cynical side says some of this negative advertising and all the stuff we talk about is an attempt by the people in power to cause us not to want to be engaged. It's much easier to rule if you only have to worry about 10% of the people. So if you turn everybody off and most of us stay home, then it's that small core of very engaged kind of insiders that will decide where we go.
And I do wonder, next year it's a lot of local elections, so town seats, village seats, county seats. I wonder if there is a translation between an election cycle like this one and maybe a couple other people who might not have considered it before, the last couple months. Hey, maybe I'll run for something next year. I genuinely wonder if there is any sort of translation there, or if that's just me being incredibly naive and hopeful.
No, I think there might be. I mean, when you look at somebody like Tracy Matrano, who didn't have any background in elective office and ran a credible race for United States House of Representatives, that might make me think, you know what, these yahoos on the town board, I don't care for what they're doing. I'm going to see if I can do better.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the items we talked about this morning on your program, the $20 million renewable energy plant in Canandaigua. And, one of the things that I didn't mention this morning that I thought you would chuckle at was, how did that not get brought up at all during the entire election cycle? How did that not get brought up before?
I didn't even know. I mean, the first I heard about this was when it came out just the other day that there was this stimulus money. And I think part of that, we talked about this a little bit, and part of the divisiveness we have, the idea in politics kind of used to be that, okay, if the Democrats have the White House for 8 years and they have their agenda, and now the Republicans win, that we're going to continue on with at least some of the things that they were doing before. Now, when party control changes, it's as if everything that happened before now becomes null and void. Perfect example, Obamacare. Democrats have charge. They pass that. As soon as Republicans get control, they try to get rid of it. So I think that there's more and more of that sense now that everything that happened before, once we're in charge, we're going to turn around and undo everything you did during your time in charge.
That's wild.
Yeah.
It's a wild dynamic because it just creates this no-win situation, it seems like.
It's going to give us plenty to talk about, though.
No doubt about that. Hey,
it's going to keep us both in business.
Thanks for coming in again. Where can folks hear you? You're on every single day. Where and when?
Finger Lakes Morning News, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9. In Geneva and points west, 95.9 and 1240 WGVA. In Auburn and points east, 98.1 and 1590 WAUB.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us today. We'll be back next week with another edition of The Debrief. But until then, don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts just like this one. Be well.